On the morning of September 14, 1872, dock workers at CARRICK-ON-SHANNON's commercial wharf discovered Patrick Brennan's body crushed beneath the hooves of his own barge horse. The 53-year-old canal worker lay face down in the mud, his skull fractured in 3 places, ribs shattered, his spine broken. The horse, a 20-year-old mare named Molly, stood over him, still hitched to the empty barge, her flanks heaving, her eyes rolling white with what witnesses described as unnatural rage. The constabulary initially ruled it a tragic accident, a spooked animal, an unfortunate misstep on the treacherous towpath, just another hazard of canal life in rural Ireland. But when the local veterinarian examined Molly later that day, what he found carved into her hide would force authorities to reconsider everything they thought they knew about Patrick Brennan. The scars told a story, the wounds revealed a pattern, and the mare's behavior suggested something far more calculated than simple animal panic. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone in Carrick-on-Shannon could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the Carrick-on-Shannon barge horse, 1872 Canal towpath animal trampled owner after 20 years service, a beaten beast's final revenge, make sure to subscribe to the Silent Abbey and ring that notification bell. We dig deep into history's darkest corners to bring you true stories that textbooks forgot. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's descend into the shadows of Victorian Ireland. Ireland in 1872 stood at a crossroads between ancient traditions and industrial modernity. The Great Famine's shadows still darkened the land, though 2 decades had passed since Black 47. The population had plummeted from over 8 million to just over 5 million souls. Those who remained scratched out existence in a country occupied by British rule, governed by Protestant landlords, worked to the bone for wages that barely kept families fed. The Royal Canal, completed in 1817, cut through the heart of County Leitrim like a commercial artery. It connected Dublin to the River Shannon, transforming sleepy river towns into bustling trade centers. Carrick-on-Shannon, positioned at this strategic junction, thrived on the canal traffic. Barges laden with turf, grain, timber, and livestock moved constantly along the waterway, pulled by horses walking the narrow towpaths that ran parallel to the dark water. These towpath horses lived brutal lives. They worked 12 to 14 hours daily, hauling loads that could exceed 20 tons. The towpath itself, a muddy strip barely 4 feet wide in places, ran treacherously close to the canal's edge. One wrong step meant drowning in the cold, peat-stained water. Most horses lasted perhaps 5 years in this work before injury, exhaustion, or disease claimed them. Patrick Brennan had worked the canal for 30 years. He lived alone in a small cottage near the wharf, his wife Margaret having died of consumption in 1867. Their 3 children had emigrated to America in the wake of the famine, and Brennan never spoke of them. Neighbors described him as a solitary man, given to drink, quick to anger when questioned about his business. He kept to himself, which suited the community fine. His horse Molly had been with him for 2 decades, an extraordinary span for a working canal animal. Brennan had acquired her as a yearling in 1852, breaking her to harness himself. Over the years, the mare had pulled his barge across thousands of miles of Irish waterways, through all weather, in all seasons. She knew every inch of the towpath from Dublin to Clondera. She knew the rhythm of the work, the weight of the loads, the commands that moved her forward or held her back. But something had been changing in the months before September 14, 1872. Mrs. Eileen O'Malley, who ran a provisions shop near the wharf, later told investigators she'd noticed Molly's condition deteriorating throughout that summer. The horse looked frightful thin, she testified. Her coat was matted and she had open sores on her shoulders where the harness rubbed. I mentioned it to Mr. Brennan once and he told me to mind my own Christian business. Thomas Riley, a fellow barge operator, had witnessed an incident in late August that should have served as a warning. I was mooring my own boat when I heard Brennan shouting, Riley testified at the subsequent inquest. He was beating that mare with a length of chain because she'd stopped to drink from the canal. He hit her at least a dozen times across the hindquarters and flanks. The animal was screaming, and I don't use that word lightly. Horses whinny or neigh, but this was screaming, a sound I'll never forget. When Riley confronted Brennan about the abuse, the older man had turned the chain on him, forcing Riley to retreat. There was a look in his eyes, Riley recalled. Pure meanness. He said the horse was his property, bought and paid for, and he'd do with her as he pleased. Said if I interfered again I'd get the same treatment. No one reported the incident to authorities. In 1872 Ireland, a man's treatment of his livestock was considered his own affair. Animals were property, tools to be used and discarded as needed. The nascent animal welfare movement that was gaining traction in England had barely touched rural Irish communities, where survival took precedence over sentiment. But those who worked the canal began to notice something unsettling about Molly's behavior. The horse that had once been docile, reliable, and steady now exhibited what bargemen called a dangerous eye. She'd turn her head to track Brennan's movements. She'd flatten her ears when he approached. She'd pull against the harness in ways she'd never done before, as if testing the strength of the leather that bound her. That horse was thinking, dock worker James Murphy would later testify. I know it sounds mad, but I swear on my mother's grave, that animal was planning something. The first documented incident occurred on July 23, 1872, during what should have been a routine run from Carrick to Termonbury. Brennan had loaded his barge with 12 tons of turf bound for a merchant in Longford. The weather was fine, the towpath dry, ideal conditions for canal work. According to the log kept by the lockkeeper at Clondera, Brennan and Molly passed through at approximately 2 p.m., making good time. But something happened between Clondera and Termonbury, a stretch of perhaps 8 miles. When Brennan arrived at the Termonbury wharf 3 hours later than expected, his face was bleeding from a deep gash above his left eye. His shirt was torn, and Molly stood in her harness, sides heaving, eyes wild, with blood flecking the foam around her mouth. The merchant who met Brennan noted the injuries in his account book. P. Brennan arrived 8 p.m. 3 hours late, face injured, claims his horse reared and knocked him against a lock gate. Animal appeared agitated and dangerous. Brennan required assistance unloading as he could barely stand. When questioned by the merchant about what had actually happened, Brennan's story changed. First he said Molly had been spooked by a fox crossing the towpath. Then he claimed she'd shied at a low-flying heron. Finally he grew angry and refused to discuss it further, demanding his payment and departing into the night. But a farmer named Declan Boyle, whose land bordered the canal, had witnessed what really occurred that day. He didn't come forward until after Brennan's death, but his testimony paints a disturbing picture. I was mending a stone wall about 50 yards from the towpath, Boyle testified. I heard shouting and looked up to see Brennan beating the horse with what looked like a leather strap. The animal was trying to move forward, but he kept hitting her over and over, across the face and neck. Then suddenly the horse reared up, fully vertical, front hooves pawing the air, and when she came down, one hoof caught Brennan on the head, knocked him flat on his back. The horse stood over him, and I swear to God I thought she was going to finish him right there. But then Brennan scrambled up, grabbed a boat hook, and jabbed her in the side until she moved away. I didn't interfere. Wasn't my business. But I'll tell you true, I've seen horses break before. Seen them go mad from abuse. That horse wasn't mad, she was angry. There's a difference. The second incident came 3 weeks later, on August 14th. Brennan was navigating the narrow portion of Canal near Drumharlow, where the towpath pinched to barely 3 feet wide with the canal on one side and a steep embankment on the other. It was treacherous passage in the best of circumstances, requiring sure-footed animals and careful handling. According to the testimony of another barge operator who was traveling in the opposite direction, Brennan's barge came around the bend moving unusually fast. The horse was practically galloping, testified Sean O'Connor. On that narrow path it was suicidal. I shouted for Brennan to slow down, but he wasn't controlling the animal. She was controlling herself, and she was running full out with that heavy barge behind her. O'Connor managed to pull his own horse and barge tight against the embankment just before Molly thundered past. I got a good look at the mare as she went by. There was purpose in her movement. This wasn't a panicked runaway. She knew exactly what she was doing. And Brennan was screaming at her from the barge, but she wasn't listening. She just kept running. A quarter mile down the towpath, Molly finally stopped, right at the edge of a section where heavy rains had eroded the path, leaving a gap barely 2 feet wide. One more step and both horse and barge would have plunged into the canal. Brennan, when he finally caught up on foot, beat Molly so severely that Mary Brennan, no relation, a washerwoman working near the canal, stopped her work to watch. He used a cudgel, she testified, a thick piece of wood. He hit that poor creature at least 20 times. Hit her so hard the wood cracked in half. The horse took it all without making a sound, just stood there, trembling, blood running down her legs. When he finally stopped, exhausted, the horse turned her head and looked at him. I've never seen an animal look at a human that way. It was pure hate. The third incident was witnessed by Father Michael Donovan, the parish priest of St. Mary's Church in CARRICK-ON-SHANNON. On September 3rd, Father Donovan was walking along the canal towpath to visit a sick parishioner when he encountered Brennan struggling with Molly near the Richmond harbor. The horse had apparently refused to move, simply standing stock still despite Brennan's commands, kicks, and strikes with a leather strap. I approached Mr. Brennan and asked if I could be of assistance, Father Donovan testified. He was red-faced, sweating profusely, and reeked of whiskey. He told me, and I apologize for the language, he told me to keep my bloody papist nose out of his affairs. I was taken aback naturally, but I persisted as the horse appeared to be in great distress. She was covered in fresh welts, her breathing was labored, and she had what appeared to be burns on her hindquarters. When Father Donovan moved closer to examine the burns, Molly did something that shocked the priest. She moved toward him, not away. The animal actually positioned herself between myself and Mr. Brennan, he recalled, as if seeking protection. I'd never seen such behavior in a horse. It was almost human in its deliberateness. Brennan, infuriated by the horse's action, struck her across the face with the leather strap, splitting the skin above her left eye. That's when I intervened, Father Donovan testified. I grabbed Mr. Brennan's arm and told him that even an animal deserved Christian mercy. He shoved me aside with considerable force, causing me to stumble. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "This animal has no soul, Father. She's mine to do with as I please, and when I'm done with her, I'll put a bullet in her head and throw her in the canal." Then he jabbed the horse with what I later realized was a lit cigar, and she finally moved forward. Father Donovan reported the incident to the local constabulary, but Constable William Henderson found no grounds for intervention. "It's a civil matter," Henderson noted in his official report. "Mr. Brennan's treatment of his animal, while perhaps excessive, does not rise to the level of criminal behavior. Animals are property under the law. Without evidence of theft or damage to another party's interests, the constabulary has no jurisdiction." But Father Donovan would not let the matter rest. He made inquiries around Carrick-on-Shannon, speaking with merchants, dock workers, and other bargemen. What he discovered troubled him deeply. Multiple witnesses reported seeing Brennan beat Molly with increasing frequency and severity throughout the summer of 1872. The pattern was consistent. Brennan would drink heavily, return to his barge, and take his rage out on the horse. Sometimes the beatings were prompted by minor infractions, the mare moving too slowly or drinking from the canal without permission. Other times they appeared to be entirely unprovoked. "I saw him kick her in the belly for no reason," testified dock worker Francis Kelly. "The horse was standing quietly, bothering no one, and Brennan walked up and kicked her so hard she groaned. When I asked what that was for, he said he didn't need a reason, said he was reminding her who was master." More disturbing were reports of deliberate cruelty that went beyond even the harsh norms of Victorian animal treatment. Several witnesses reported seeing Brennan deny Molly water for hours, even on hot days, keeping her standing in her harness under the brutal sun. Others reported he'd begun reducing her feed rations, despite the heavy work she was required to perform. The mare grew progressively thinner, her ribs becoming visible through her dull coat. "He was starving that horse," testified grain merchant Robert Walsh. "I mentioned to him that Molly looked poorly and he laughed, said she was getting fat and lazy and needed to learn some discipline. The animal wasn't fat, she was wasting away. But perhaps most chilling were reports of Brennan talking to the horse. Not commands, but long, rambling monologues delivered in a low, threatening tone. "I heard him one night," testified Margaret Byrne, whose cottage backed onto the wharf. "It was past midnight and I couldn't sleep because of the heat. My window was open and I heard Brennan's voice coming from his barge. He was talking to the horse, saying terrible things. He blamed her for his wife's death, though I don't know how a horse could be responsible for consumption. He said she'd ruined his life. Said she was a demon in horse form, sent to torment him. Said he knew she was planning something, but he'd break her will before she got the chance. It went on for over an hour, this mad, drunken rambling. The horse never made a sound, but I could hear her moving in her stall, restless, like she understood every word. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. What we're about to uncover gets even more disturbing. Let's discover what happens next." September 14th, 1872. Dawned cool and misty over Carrick-on-Shannon. The autumn had arrived early that year, bringing with it the smell of peat smoke and decaying leaves. Patrick Brennan was scheduled to transport a load of timber from the Carrick Wharf to Mullingar, a journey of approximately 40 miles that would take 2 full days of hard travel. Dock workers reported seeing Brennan arrive. He at the wharf around 5 a.m., already unsteady on his feet, his breath reeking of poitin, the potent illegal whiskey that fueled much of rural Ireland's social life and domestic violence. Molly was hitched to the empty barge, and witnesses noted her condition had deteriorated even further since Father Donovan's report 11 days earlier. "The horse looked like death," testified dock supervisor Michael Connolly. "Her head hung low, her coat was matted with mud and filth, and she had fresh wounds on her flanks. Open wounds, weeping clear fluid. I almost refused to allow the barge to depart, as the animal appeared unfit for work, but Mr. Brennan became belligerent when I suggested he rest the horse for a few days. He said he had a contract to fulfill and no one would stop him. The timber was loaded, approximately 8 tons of cut oak planks, a heavy load but not unreasonable for a healthy draft horse. For an animal in Molly's condition, it was a cruel burden. Brennan and Molly departed the wharf at approximately 6:30 a.m. The towpath heading south toward Drumsna was well maintained and relatively straight, offering good visibility. Several people saw them pass. No one reported anything unusual, until 7:45 a.m. A farm laborer named Patrick O'Neill was driving cattle across the bridge near Jamestown when he heard shouting from the towpath below. Looking down, he saw Brennan stumbling along behind Molly, who had stopped moving about 200 yards from the bridge. Brennan was roaring drunk, O'Neill testified, screaming at the horse to move. She just stood there, head down, refusing to take another step. I watched for maybe 5 minutes, and in that time, Brennan hit her with his walking stick at least 30 times. The horse didn't react, didn't even flinch, just stood there like a statue. O'Neill continued driving his cattle across the bridge and thought nothing more of the incident until he heard the news later that day. The next and final witness to see Patrick Brennan alive was a traveling tinker named William Joyce, who was camped near the canal about half a mile south of the Jamestown Bridge. Joyce was breaking down his camp when he heard ungodly screaming from the direction of the towpath. I ran toward the sound, Joyce testified at the inquest. I thought someone was being murdered. When I reached the path, I saw the barge horse rearing up again and again, her hooves striking down. There was a man underneath her. He was trying to crawl away, but the horse followed him, rearing and striking. I shouted at the animal, tried to scare her off, but she ignored me completely. She was focused entirely on the man beneath her. It was the most deliberate thing I've ever seen an animal do. Joyce estimated the attack lasted approximately 2 minutes, though he admitted his perception of time may have been distorted by the horror of what he was witnessing. The horse reared at least 12 times, he testified. Each time she came down, I heard bones breaking. The man stopped moving after maybe the 4th or 5th strike, but the horse didn't stop. She kept rearing and striking, until she was satisfied he was dead. When Molly finally stopped, she stood over Brennan's body, her sides heaving, her hooves and lower legs covered in blood. She made no attempt to flee. She simply stood there, still hitched to the loaded barge, watching as Joyce slowly approached. I've worked with horses all my life, Joyce testified. I've seen mean horses, spooked horses, horses gone mad from pain or fear. This was different. This horse was calm. When I got close enough to see her eyes, there was no panic there, no madness. She looked at me, and then she looked down at the body, and then she looked at me again. I swear on my children's lives, that animal knew exactly what she'd done and she had no regrets. Joyce carefully unhitched Molly from the barge and led her away from Brennan's body. The mare followed him docilely, showing no signs of agitation or aggression. He tied her to a tree approximately 20 yards from the scene and then ran to the nearest farm to report what had happened. By 9 a.m., Constable William Henderson and Dr. Thomas Murphy arrived at the scene. What they found would be documented in meticulous clinical detail in the official coroner's report. Patrick Brennan lay face down in the mud of the towpath. Dr. Murphy counted 14 separate hoof strike wounds on the body. The skull had been fractured in 3 places, with fragments of bone driven into the brain tissue. 6 ribs on the left side were shattered. The right arm was broken in 2 places. The spine showed evidence of catastrophic trauma at the 3rd and 4th lumbar vertebrae. Both lungs had been punctured by broken ribs. Death would have occurred within the first minute of the attack, Dr. Murphy noted in his report. The skull fractures alone would have been fatal. However, the animal continued the assault well beyond the point of the victim's death, suggesting sustained aggressive intent rather than momentary panic. The position of the body told its own story. Brennan had been attempting to crawl away when he died. His fingers were dug into the mud, his body oriented toward the canal as if he'd been trying to reach the water. Drag marks in the mud suggested he'd covered approximately 6 feet during the attack, with the horse following and striking him repeatedly as he crawled. Most telling was the evidence found clutched in Brennan's right hand, a blood-covered length of leather strap, studded with metal tacks. This appears to be an improvised whip, Dr. Murphy noted. The tacks are arranged in such a way as to cause maximum pain and damage to an animal's hide. Analysis of the blood on the strap suggests it was being used immediately before the victim's death. When Dr. Murphy examined Molly later that morning, what he discovered shocked even the hardened veterinarian. The mare's body was covered in scars, both old and new. Some appeared to be years old, thick ridges of scar tissue across her shoulders, flanks, and hindquarters. Others were fresh, still weeping, showing evidence of deliberate, repeated trauma. Dr. Murphy counted over 60 distinct wound sites on the animal's body, but most disturbing were the burns. The horse showed evidence of extensive burn injuries, Dr. Murphy wrote in his veterinary report. Circular burns approximately 1 inch in diameter, consistent with cigar or cigarette burns, were present on the animal's hindquarters, flanks, and lower belly. I counted 23 such burns in various stages of healing. The pattern and placement suggest these injuries were inflicted deliberately and repeatedly over an extended period. The mare's shoulders bore deep infected pressure sores where the harness collar had rubbed against raw flesh. Her hooves showed evidence of severe neglect. They hadn't been trimmed in months, causing her to walk with an unnatural, painful gait. Her teeth revealed she'd been kept on starvation rations. The wear patterns indicated she'd been gnawing on wood, likely her stall, attempting to supplement her diet. In my professional opinion, Dr. Murphy concluded, this animal had been subjected to systematic, prolonged abuse of the most severe nature. The cumulative effect of this mistreatment would have caused constant, unrelenting pain. That the horse remained functional at all is a testament to the species' extraordinary resilience and pain tolerance. When Constable Henderson examined the contents of Brennan's pockets, he found several items that added context to the tragedy. A flask containing poiton, a leather wallet with 3 shillings and 8 pence, a tobacco pouch with loose tobacco and 3 cigars, and a small notebook. The notebook entries would prove crucial to understanding what had happened on that September morning. Brennan had been keeping a record of what he called the mare's defiance. Entries dating back to mid-July documented instances when Molly had refused commands, moved too slowly, or showed insolence in her behavior. Next to each entry, Brennan had noted his method of correction: beatings, starvation, burns, denial of water. The final entry, written the night before his death, read, "The demon beast refuses to break. Tomorrow I will teach her final obedience. She will submit, or I will end her." Constable Henderson's official report concluded, the deceased Patrick Brennan met his death as a result of injuries sustained from his own horse. Evidence suggests the attack was provoked by the deceased's violent treatment of the animal. While tragic, this appears to be a consequence of the deceased's own actions, rather than criminal behavior by any other party. The death of Patrick Brennan created an unusual legal and moral dilemma for the authorities in County Leitrim. How does one prosecute a horse for murder? The question was not entirely facetious. Under British law in 1872, animals that killed humans could be, and frequently were, destroyed as a matter of public safety. Deodand law, which allowed for the confiscation of any object or animal that caused a human death, was still occasionally invoked, though it had been officially abolished in 1846. Local sentiment would determine Molly's fate. Constable Henderson consulted with the county inspector, who in turn consulted with magistrates in Carrick-on-Shannon. The initial consensus was that Molly should be destroyed immediately. A horse that had killed once might kill again. Public safety demanded her execution, but Father Donovan intervened. The priest petitioned the magistrates for a formal inquest into Patrick Brennan's death, arguing that the circumstances surrounding the killing deserved thorough investigation before any judgment was rendered against the animal. This was not a case of an animal gone mad, Father Donovan argued before the magistrates on September 17th. This was a case of sustained abuse finally reaching its terrible conclusion. To destroy the horse without examining the full context would be to compound one injustice with another. The magistrates, swayed by Father Donovan's arguments and the growing public interest in the case, agreed to convene a coroner's inquest. The hearing was scheduled for September 23, 1872, at the Carrick-on-Shannon courthouse. In the meantime, Molly was placed in the care of the Royal Canal Company, which maintained stables near the wharf. The company's head stableman, Charles Whitmore, was instructed to keep the mare isolated and under observation. Whitmore's daily reports on Molly's behavior during this 9-day period provide fascinating insight into the animal's state of mind following the killing. Day 1, September 14th. Animal is calm but exhausted. Shows no signs of aggression toward handlers. Allowed me to approach and examine her wounds without resistance. She ate normally when offered hay and oats. Drank heavily from water trough. Appears relieved to be away from her former owner. Day 3, September 16th. Mare's wounds are being treated with poultices. She stands quietly during treatment, though the procedures must be painful. Dr. Murphy examined her again today and expressed amazement at her docility. She follows me around the stable yard like a dog, seeming to crave human contact despite her history of abuse. Day 5, September 18th. Remarkable change in the animal's condition. Her coat is improving with proper grooming and nutrition. She has gained noticeable weight. Her eyes, which appeared dull and lifeless when she first arrived, now show alertness and intelligence. She nickers softly when I approach, which Dr. Murphy says is normal horse behavior, but which I find somehow unsettling given what this animal did 9 days ago. Day 7, September 20th, the mare is now fully cooperative with all handling. She accepts the farrier's work on her hooves without compla, despite the fact that the trimming process must be causing her significant discomfort given the neglected state of her feet. I've worked with hundreds of horses in my career, and I can honestly say I've never encountered an animal that seemed so aware of human intentions and emotions. She watches everything I do with an intelligence that goes beyond normal equine observation. The inquest convened on schedule, drawing unprecedented public attention. The courthouse was packed with spectators, journalists from Dublin papers, and representatives from the newly formed Irish Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Coroner James McCarthy presided over the proceedings. Over 3 days of testimony, the inquest heard from 24 witnesses, examined physical evidence, and reviewed veterinary reports. The testimony painted a comprehensive picture of Patrick Brennan's systematic abuse and Molly's eventual fatal retaliation. Dr. Murphy's veterinary testimony proved particularly compelling. He brought detailed sketches of the mare's injuries and explained to the court, in layman's terms, the severity and cumulative effect of the abuse she had endured. "Gentlemen of the jury," Dr. Murphy testified, "I have practiced veterinary medicine for 18 years. I have treated hundreds of working horses, many of whom were subjected to harsh conditions and rough handling. This is the nature of agricultural and commercial horse work, but what was done to this animal goes far beyond the normal hardships of working life. The injuries I documented represent sustained, deliberate torture. The psychological impact of such treatment, combined with constant physical pain, would have been unbearable." When Dr. Murphy was asked whether animals could experience emotions like anger or desire for revenge, his answer was carefully measured. "The science of animal psychology is still in its infancy. I cannot definitively state that horses experience emotions in the same way humans do. However, I can state with certainty that horses have excellent memories, that they can distinguish between individuals who treat them well and those who treat them poorly, and that they are capable of learned behaviors, including aggressive responses to specific triggers or individuals." The testimony of William Joyce, the tinker who witnessed the actual killing, captivated the courtroom. His description of Molly's deliberate, methodical attack challenged common assumptions about animal behavior. "The horse knew what she was doing," Joyce testified. "This wasn't panic. This wasn't a spooked animal lashing out blindly. Every movement was purposeful. When the man tried to crawl away, the horse followed. She adjusted her position to stay above him. She reared and struck with a rhythm to it, like she was making sure the job was finished." Under cross-examination, Joyce was asked if he believed the horse had planned the attack in advance. His answer would be widely quoted in newspaper coverage of the trial. "I'm not saying the horse woke that morning and decided to kill her master, but I am saying that when the opportunity presented itself, when the man was down and vulnerable, the horse took it, and she didn't stop until she was satisfied he couldn't hurt her anymore. Call it instinct, call it animal intelligence, call it whatever you like, but don't call it an accident." Father Donovan's testimony focused on the broader moral implications of the case. "We stand at a crossroads," he told the court. "Our laws recognize animals only as property devoid of rights or protections, but this case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. If we subject an animal to sustained torture, do we not bear some responsibility when that animal finally strikes back? If we deny a creature any recourse against its tormentor, can we truly be surprised when it takes the only recourse available to it, violence?" The priest's words resonated with many in the courtroom, but they also sparked controversy. Several letters to the editor in Dublin papers condemned Father Donovan's position as dangerous sentimentality that elevated animals to human status and threatened to undermine the proper hierarchy of creation. But public sentiment was shifting. The inquest had brought to light the full extent of Patrick Brennan's cruelty, and sympathy for Molly grew with each day of testimony. Petitions began circulating in Carrick-on-Shannon and surrounding communities, calling for the mare to be spared. The Irish Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals offered to take custody of Molly if the court would agree not to order her destruction. "This animal has suffered enough," their representative argued. "She should not be punished for defending herself against a prolonged campaign of torture." On September 26, 1872, the coroner's jury returned its verdict. "We find that Patrick Brennan died as a result of injuries sustained from his horse, Molly. We further find that the deceased had subjected said animal to prolonged and severe abuse, which directly precipitated the fatal attack." While we acknowledge the tragedy of Mr. Brennan's death, we cannot in good conscience recommend the destruction of an animal that was acting in response to sustained mistreatment. We recommend that the horse be removed from commercial service and placed in the care of a responsible party who will ensure her proper treatment for the remainder of her natural life. The verdict was unprecedented. For the first time in Irish legal history, a coroner's jury had essentially exonerated an animal for killing a human, citing provocation and mitigating circumstances. But the case wasn't entirely closed. Patrick Brennan's estate, modest though it was, became the subject of legal wrangling. His 3 children in America, who hadn't communicated with their father in years, suddenly came forward claiming ownership of his assets, including Molly. They petitioned to have the mare sold at auction with proceeds to be divided among them. The Irish Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals fought the petition, arguing that selling Molly would violate the spirit of the coroner's verdict and potentially place her back in an abusive situation. The legal battle continued for months, finally being resolved in February 1873 when a county court judge ruled that Molly could not be sold as chattel given the unique circumstances of the case. This animal's history and the manner of her former owner's death create a special circumstance, Judge Patrick O'Brien ruled. To treat her as ordinary property would be to ignore the profound moral questions this case has raised. I hereby order that the horse known as Molly be permanently removed from commercial service and placed in the custody of the Irish Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, with the stipulation that she never again be subjected to harness work or sold to any private party. The Brennan children appealed the decision but ultimately abandoned the effort when the legal costs exceeded the potential value of the asset. Molly was transferred to a farm in County Meath owned by a wealthy supporter of the ISPCA. There, for the first time in her 20-year life, she lived in a proper pasture with adequate food, veterinary care, and no work requirements. Charles Whitmore, the stableman who had cared for Molly during the inquest, later wrote about visiting her at the Meath farm 6 months after the killing. I barely recognized the animal. She had gained considerable weight. Her coat gleamed with health, and she moved with an ease I'd never seen when she was in harness. She came to the fence when I called her name, and when I reached out to stroke her face, she leaned into my hand with what I can only describe as contentment. Whatever demons had driven her to violence were gone. She was, at last, simply a horse. The CARRICK-ON-SHANNON case sent ripples through Victorian society, sparking debates about animal rights, cruelty, and the moral obligations humans owed to the creatures in their care. The case received extensive coverage in Irish and British newspapers throughout the autumn of 1872. The Times of London ran a series of editorials debating whether animals could be held morally responsible for their actions and whether human cruelty could justify animal violence. The Irish Times published testimonials from veterinarians and horse trainers across Ireland, many of whom reported similar cases of abused animals attacking their tormentors. The publicity surrounding the case energized the nascent animal welfare movement in Ireland, the Irish Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, founded in 1840 but largely ineffective in rural areas, saw a surge in membership and donations following the inquest. Local chapters began forming in towns across the country, with volunteers monitoring the treatment of working animals and reporting egregious cases of abuse to authorities. More significantly, the case prompted legislative action. In March 1873, Irish MP Jonathan Pym introduced a bill in Parliament to strengthen penalties for animal cruelty and create enforcement mechanisms for existing animal welfare laws. While the bill faced opposition from agricultural interests who feared government overreach, it eventually passed in modified form as the Protection of Animals Act of 1873. The new law increased fines for animal cruelty, created a framework for authorities to confiscate abused animals, and most importantly, established that willful and sustained abuse could be prosecuted as a criminal offense rather than merely a civil matter. Constables were given explicit authority to intervene in cases of obvious animal suffering, ending the doctrine that treatment of livestock was purely a private affair. The Brennan case taught us that turning a blind eye to cruelty has consequences, Jonathan Pym said in parliamentary debate. When we allow animals to be tortured with impunity, we degrade not only the animals but ourselves. We create conditions where violence becomes inevitable. The law must reflect our collective responsibility to prevent such outcomes. The case also influenced veterinary medicine and animal psychology. Dr. Thomas Murphy published a monograph in 1874 titled On the Mental Faculties of Working Horses, in which he argued for greater recognition of equine intelligence and emotional capacity. The monograph, based partly on his observations of Molly, challenged prevailing assumptions that animals were mere automata incapable of complex thought or feeling. The Carrick mare demonstrated clear evidence of memory, discrimination, and purposeful action, Murphy wrote. To dismiss her behavior as mere instinct is to ignore the obvious evidence before us. Animals may not reason as humans do, but they possess a form of intelligence uniquely suited to their nature. They remember kindness and cruelty. They respond to consistent patterns of treatment, and when subjected to unrelenting abuse, they may, like any tormented creature, eventually strike back. Murphy's work influenced a generation of veterinarians and contributed to more humane treatment standards for working animals throughout the British Empire. But perhaps the most significant impact of the Carrick-on-Shannon case was cultural rather than legal. The story of Molly's revenge became folklore, spreading through rural Ireland in songs, poems, and stories. Bargemen told the tale to new workers as a cautionary example of why horses should be treated with respect. Farmers used it to teach children about the consequences of cruelty. A ballad titled The Barge Horse's Revenge was composed by an anonymous author in late 1872 and became popular in Irish pubs for decades. While the lyrics romanticized and dramatized the events, they captured the moral lesson that resonated with working-class audiences. For 20 years she bore our load, through rain and snow along the road, but kindness was a thing he never showed, to the barge horse of the canal. With whip and chain and burning brand, he ruled that mare with cruel hand, until one day she took her final stand, the barge horse of the canal. The case also prompted soul-searching within the Catholic Church about humanity's relationship with animals. Several prominent priests, including Father Donovan, began incorporating animal welfare themes into their sermons, arguing that Christian mercy should extend to all of God's creatures. We cannot claim to love our neighbors while showing callous indifference to the suffering of animals, Father Donovan preached in a widely distributed sermon from October 1872. The humble horse, the loyal dog, the patient ox, these creatures serve us faithfully, and we owe them gratitude and kindness in return. When we fail in this obligation, we fail in our basic humanity. In the broader context of Victorian attitudes toward animals, the Carrick-on-Shannon case represented a turning point. The 1870s saw increasing recognition that animals could suffer, that their suffering mattered morally, and that humans had obligations beyond mere property rights. The case also revealed uncomfortable truths about rural Irish society in the post-famine era. Patrick Brennan's alcoholism, isolation, and violence toward his horse mirrored patterns of domestic abuse that were epidemic but largely hidden in Irish communities. The horse, unable to leave or seek help, endured what many women and children endured, sustained private torture that society chose to ignore until violence erupted. Several feminist writers of the period drew parallels between Molly's situation and that of women trapped in abusive marriages. Like the barge horse, women are considered property under law, wrote Irish suffragist Anna Haslam in 1873. Like the barge horse, we are expected to endure mistreatment in silence. The mare's story is our story, and her desperate act of self-defense resonates with every woman who has been pushed beyond endurance. The case influenced literature, as well. Several novels published in the late 1870s and early 1880s featured plotlines inspired by the Carrick incident, exploring themes of abuse, revenge, and the moral status of animals. Most famously, Anna Sewell's Black Beauty, 1877, drew on the publicity surrounding the Carrick case to argue for better treatment of horses. While Sewell's novel was set in England, she referenced the Irish incident in her personal correspondence, noting that the terrible story from Carrick-on-Shannon shows what horses may be driven to when all gentleness is beaten out of them. For the canal workers and bargemen of Ireland, the case had immediate practical effects. Treatment of horses improved markedly in the months following the inquest. Witnesses to abuse were more willing to report it, and authorities were more willing to intervene. The Royal Canal Company issued new guidelines for the treatment of towpath horses, including mandatory rest days, feeding standards, and prohibitions on certain punishment methods. "We cannot afford another Carrick incident," the company's managing director wrote in an internal memo from November 1872. Beyond the moral imperative to treat animals humanely, there is a practical consideration. A dead bargeman and a horse that cannot work represents a complete failure of our operations. Better treatment of animals is simply better business. The case even reached international audiences. American newspapers picked up the story, with many drawing comparisons to debates about slavery and animal rights that were occurring in post-Civil War America. The parallels were sometimes explicit. If enslaved humans could justly resist their oppressors, could the same logic apply to enslaved animals? These were radical questions for 1872, and they made many people uncomfortable. But the Carrick-on-Shannon case forced the questions to public discourse and kept them there. What do you think drove Patrick Brennan to such systematic cruelty? Was it simply alcoholism and isolation, or was there something darker at work? And what about Molly? Was her final act simple animal self-defense, or did it represent something more complex, perhaps even a form of calculated revenge? The line between human and animal behavior is thinner than we often acknowledge. Both species feel pain. Both remember. Both can reach a breaking point where violence becomes the only perceived option. Leave your theories in the comments below. Do you think Molly understood what she was doing when she killed Brennan? Do you think the coroner's jury made the right decision in sparing her life? And what does this 1872 case teach us about how we treat animals and each other today? Subscribe for more lost chapters of history where violence, cruelty, and justice collide in unexpected ways. Next week, we'll explore another dark corner of the past that reveals uncomfortable truths about human nature. Until then, remember, every act of cruelty creates a debt that eventually comes due. Patrick Brennan paid his in full on a muddy towpath in September 1872. The question is, how many others are still accumulating theirs? See you in the next video.